Welcome back. We've had a wonderful morning session, and I'm sure these sessions will be equally productive. So can I now request Professor Meenakshi Thapun to introduce Professor Richard Davidson, who will be delivering this presentation to follow.
Professor, I'd like to quickly introduce Professor Davidson to you. He is the William James and Vilas Professor, is that how you say it, of Psychology and Psychiatry, and Director of the Weizmann Laboratory for Brain Imaging and Behavior and the Laboratory for Affective Neuroscience, and founder and chair of the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds. This is at the Weizmann Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the US. He received his PhD from Harvard University in psychology and has been at Wisconsin since 1984. He has published more than 275 articles, many chapters and reviews, and edited 13 books. He has been a member of the Mind and Life Institute since 1991, and he is the author of his most recent publication with Sharon Begley, The Emotional Life of Your Brain, published by Penguin in 2012, last year. In 2008, he founded the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds, which is a research center dedicated to the study of positive qualities such as kindness and compassion. In 2011, he was given the Paul D. MacLean Award for Outstanding Neuroscience Research in Psychosomatic Medicine. He serves on the Scientific Advisory Board of the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences, and as chair of the psychology section of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Please welcome Professor Davidson, and we look forward to his talk this afternoon. Thank you, Richie.
Thank you so much, Meenakshi, and thank you, Your Holiness, for inspiring us in this endeavor. And let me say at the outset that one of the things that I try to teach my students is that although science has made great strides and progress over the last several decades, it's important to be honest about how much we don't know. And the recognition of how little we know is really, I think, a source of helping us to cultivate humility in the face of enormous complexity and problems which we're dealing with. So this is really a very initial effort along these lines, but so much more work needs to be done. I'd also like to thank our hosts here at Delhi University for bringing us together in this important way. What I'd like to do today is talk about four things. The first is to talk about basic goodness as an innate quality of human beings, as well as a quality that we see in our non-human ancestors. And this provides some scientific basis for understanding, I think, and building a foundation for secular ethics. That we can actually discern these positive qualities very, very early in life and see them also in non-human primates. The second point that I'll make is that the brain is plastic, and what we mean by that is we mean that it can be shaped by experience and by training. And because of that, contemplative training in the form of mental practice, we think can cultivate certain important skills that may be central to building a curriculum for secular ethics, including mindfulness, kindness, compassion, and well-being. And the final point, which is really part of the last point, is that through these kinds of practices and training, the brain can be transformed both functionally as well as actually structurally. The very structure of the brain can be changed. So I'd like to begin now with research on basic goodness, and this research has focused primarily on looking at very, very young children. infants to determine whether signs of basic goodness can be observed very, very early in life. And I'd like to show you two very short video clips. These were actually used in a research study that was published a number of years ago where 6-month-old infants, these are human infants 6 months of age, were watching these video clips. So this is one of the video clips. Okay, and now a second video clip that they were also shown. Now, these are 6-month-old infants. Guess which video clip infants strongly preferred using various behavioral measures of preference. 6-month-old infants dramatically prefer the first video clip, which is a clip showing being helped. And this is a huge difference that is observed at 6 months of age. And it suggests that infants of 6 months of age are able to tell something about qualities of sharing and helping and kindness as opposed to qualities associated with thwarting an individual's goals, with hindering, and with a certain kind of aggression. Now, in another, this is a very, very recent study, a very different kind of study. This was done in 2-year-old children. And what they did in 2-year-old children is to give them treats, which kids really like. And what they showed is that when a child receives a treat, if you look at this middle bar here, this is a rating by observers of how happy the children appear to be. And then when they were given a series of 8 treats, the children's level of happiness was so-so. It was in between, sort of moderate levels of happiness. When the experimenter found treats to give to a puppet that the child really liked, the happiness of the child actually went up a little. Then when the child found some treats which they can give to the puppet themselves, their level of happiness goes up even more. When the child gave his own treats, treats that the child was given to keep for him or herself, when they gave them his own treats, that's when their level of happiness was actually the highest. When they were giving to others and when they were giving in a way that actually cost them something, when they were giving their own treats, is when they were the most happy. And this is in 2-year-old children. And I think this scientifically confirms something that Your Holiness talks a lot about, which is that the origins of happiness, or a way to catalyze happiness, is to be kind toward others. And what this study shows is that in children as young as 2 years of age, we see evidence for this in a very robust way. Now, what about in our non-human ancestors? This is a study that was done in bonobo apes. And bonobos turns out to be more like humans than any other apes in terms of their brain structure. And what was done in this experiment is that a bonobo was placed in the middle of this apparatus, where on one side of the apparatus was another bonobo, a group mate, someone that they were very familiar with, And in a second part of the apparatus was So in the second part of the apparatus was a stranger, a bonobo that they had never seen before. And the bonobo in the middle, the subject of this experiment, was given delicious food that the bonobo liked a lot. And so the question is, first of all, whether the bonobo would share the food. 85% of the bonobos that were tested in this experiment shared their food. And it turns out that they share their food primarily with strangers. That is, with individuals who they've never had any social contact with, and that gives them apparently more pleasure than sharing it with someone they even know very well. And so the way you can actually see this experiment done, this is another little videotape, and you'll see in just a moment what occurs. So this is the bonobo in here that the initial bonobo was familiar with. Then the subject gets to choose who they want to share the food with. This is the bonobo that just entered this apparatus, and there's food on the floor. And he actually has a key where he unlocks a door, and he's now letting in the stranger to play with the stranger and to share his food. And this quality of sharing, particularly sharing with a stranger, is something that is not very common in primate species. We see it, of course, in humans, but this is some of the first evidence that it actually is present in species other than humans. So this work that I just showed you is just a snippet of research that suggests that qualities of basic goodness are present very early in life, in human life, and they also are present in non-human primates. I'd like to now move on to the subject of brain plasticity, because this is such a central feature of this whole area, because if a curriculum on secular ethics is going to be embodied and enduring in an individual, from the perspective of neuroscience, we would say that it's critical that the kind of education which is being offered is education which actually can change the brain, which will produce enduring changes in the brain. So what is the evidence that the brain can change in this way? And I'd like to give you several different kinds of evidence. First, studies from animals where they can actually look at individual cells here show that when chronic stress is experienced by an individual, there are actually changes in the very structure of brain cells. And on the left panel here, what we see is a control animal and then an animal who has been undergoing a stressful challenge. And you can see that the branches, the dendrites that are extending from this cell actually become fewer in number. There is an actual shrinkage of the processes in the cell. And other parts of the brain, as we see on the right, in response to the same kind of challenge, actually become enhanced. So the amygdala, which is an area that's critical for threat and for certain kinds of negative emotion, actually shows an extended series of processes on the cell in response to this same kind of challenge. So even at the cellular level, there is neuroplasticity. Now, what about at a more macro level in adults? We've studied this in a number of different ways. This is the work of a student from our lab who is studying adolescents, children who are approximately 14 and 15 years of age, who experienced life stress. And what was observed is that there's a certain area of the frontal cortex which is actually diminished in size as a function of this stress. And this is an area which turns out to be very important for certain kinds of cognitive functions. The ability to hold information in one's mind and keep it there in a conscious way is impaired. And it's impaired to the extent that this area of the brain actually shrinks as a consequence of exposure to stress. So these are examples of the deleterious or negative effects. So neuroplasticity by itself is not positive or negative. It depends on the experience. And if there's a healthy, growth-promoting, nourishing experience, the changes in the brain may support positive qualities of mind. But if we're exposed to negative influences, then that also can shape the brain, but shape it in ways which have these unfortunate consequences. So this is a study which very recently was published, which is quite remarkable, by a group in Israel that showed that 2 hours of playing a video game was enough to change the structure of the human brain. 2 hours. So brain scans were done before and after 2 hours of game playing, and the change occurred in a region of the brain that we know to be very important for memory. And it turned out that the magnitude of change in the brain very strongly predicted how well they performed on this video game. Now, Your Holiness, at a meeting in Washington, D.C., in which you participated, that was organized by the Mind and Life Institute in 2009 on education. In the last panel, I was part of that panel, and we had a very stimulating discussion about areas that are important for the future. And one of the things that was discussed is video and computer games. And the suggestion was made that maybe we can develop games that would actually promote positive qualities of mind rather than games that promote violence and aggression. And I'm very pleased to report that in August of this past year, there was a meeting that was convened at the White House that involved a small group of scientists, a small group of individuals from gaming corporations that make games, and a small group of government and foundation staff people. And the focus of the meeting was on games and well-being from a neuroscientific perspective. And there are now several groups throughout the world that are developing games that are intended to promote mindfulness and kindness based upon this kind of information, that even short amounts of game playing can influence the brain. And if we can use media that our children spend a lot of time with anyway, maybe we can use it for more constructive purposes. And the game industry, I think, is now extremely sensitive to this. And the Vice President of the United States just held a meeting this past Friday with the industry leaders who are developing video games in response to the shooting that occurred in Newtown, Connecticut, because it was found that the individual who committed this crime actually spent an enormous number of hours playing violent video games. So I think this is an important topic for the future. So I'd like to now move on to how we can harness the facts of neuroplasticity and study the impact of contemplative practice on these kinds of brain changes. So I'll just give a few different examples. And the first is the study of attention. Arthur gave us this wonderful quote from William James from more than 100 years ago from his chapter on attention, where William James talked about the education of attention. And one way scientists measure attention is what's called the attentional blink. And the attentional blink is when our attention is momentarily distracted, when we no longer are sensitive to what's going on in the environment because we may pay attention to one thing and we're so invested in that one thing that we fail to pay attention to something that occurs just after that initial stimulus that we are attending to. So we can actually demonstrate the attentional blink right now. So if you all just look at this cross, I will show you a series of letters and numbers. And I'd just like you to, each of you, to just see what numbers you can discern as the numbers go by. Was the number 1 presented? You can just show hands. Anyone see the number 1, number 2, number 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, all of you, so this is what you saw. You saw a bunch of letters, and you saw the number 3. Most of you got the number 3, and then there were a couple of letters in between, and then you quickly saw after that the number 7. Many of you saw the 7, but not as many as saw the 3. And the ones who saw the 3 but not the 7 exhibited what we call the attentional blink, which is the mind being distracted by noticing the first number, the 3, and then not being able to pick up the second number, which was 7. Now, we asked the question whether 3 months of mindfulness meditation practice can change this. And it turns out that on the left we have practitioners who go through 3 months of mindfulness meditation training, and in the light gray bar is before they went through the training, and the black bar is after the training. And then we have a group of controls on the right who did not go through the training. And what you can see is that after 3 months of practice, individuals' performance becomes enhanced. They can actually do this better. So their attention is being educated. And it turns out that there are all kinds of changes in the brain. We don't need to go through the details, but there are changes in the brain that occur that are associated with the changes that we see in their performance. So this suggests that 3 months of practice can change the brain and change our behavior so that attention is actually more skillfully deployed. Now, a subject that Tanya will talk a lot more about in just a few minutes, short-term as well as longer-term training in compassion practices can also change the brain. This was a study that we did with university students, and we're talking here about the introduction of a curriculum in the university. And one of the ways that we decided to do this is to actually deliver these practices over the internet, where the students can actually log on to a website where they got a guided contemplative practice in a completely secular way for 30 minutes every day. And we compared it to a group that received a different kind of training that was also designed to promote well-being, but comes from a Western psychotherapeutic tradition, which is cognitive therapy. And Your Holiness has met Aaron Beck, who is the developer of cognitive therapy, mostly used to treat individuals with depression and anxiety to help them to change the nature of their thought patterns. So we compared a simple form of compassion practice with this kind of cognitive therapy. And they just did this for 2 weeks for 30 minutes a day. So the elements of the compassion training that we used included contemplating and visualizing the suffering and then wishing the freedom from that suffering for different categories of people. We first began with a loved one. We then moved on to themselves. We then moved on to a stranger, and we defined a stranger as someone who they can recognize, whose face they can recognize, but they don't know that person very well. So visualize a time in their life when they may have been suffering, a difficult person, and then as many other beings as they can envision. They used a phrase like, may you be free from suffering, may you experience joy and ease. This is all completely secular in the way it was presented. They were instructed to notice whatever changes in their body may occur as they were doing this. And they were instructed to feel the compassion emotionally and not to simply repeat the phrases cognitively. And the way this worked is that participants were randomly assigned. Students were assigned to either the compassion group or to this cognitive reappraisal group, cognitive training. And they got an MRI scan before they started. They went through the training, and then they got a second scan at the end. And then they engaged in several different kinds of tasks that were designed to assess altruistic behavior and fairness. And one of those measures was a measure where participants had to, they were witnessing an unfair financial previous. Reappraisal training is it's a form of cognitive therapy. Changing a person's, the way they think about the causes of negative events. So rather, if something, for example, if a student receives a poor grade on an exam, instead of thinking that it means that I'm a stupid person who's not intelligent, to reframe it and think, well, maybe this exam is very difficult. Maybe the instructor gave an unfair exam, rather than that it's because of me that I have a problem. So that they're taught to change the way they think about these negative events. And what we saw is that after 2 weeks of compassion training, the participants, when they observed an unfair transaction, they were willing to use more of their own money to render that transaction to be more equitable. So they were behaving more altruistically and had a stronger fairness norm that they were using compared to the participants who received the cognitive therapy. And there are all kinds of changes in the brain, and I won't go through the details here, but the changes in the brain that occurred were changes that were correlated with how altruistic they behaved on this decision-making task. Now, Your Holiness mentioned earlier in your remarks that when if a person is angry, it has potentially negative effects for health. And in one of our early studies, what we did is we gave people a flu shot at the end of 2 months of mindfulness meditation training. This is with John Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness-based stress reduction, in addition to other measures that we were taking of the brain. And what was remarkable is that we were able to measure the impact of the flu vaccine by looking at the antibody titers in response to the vaccine. This tells us how effective the vaccine is working. And what we see is that after 2 months of training, the participants in red are in the meditation group. The controls who received no meditation training are in blue, showing that the flu shot is actually more effective after 2 months of mindfulness meditation training. So this doesn't just affect the brain or the mind, it also affects the body in ways that may be beneficial for our physical health. If these individuals are exposed to the same level of flu virus, the meditators who have the higher antibody titers would have a better defense against the virus than the control participants. Now, I want to end this with an example that is very current. One of the things that Your Holiness mentioned is that the curriculum for secular ethics should be a curriculum that goes from very early in childhood through university. And one of the things that we know about the brain is that it is more plastic early in life, where it's capable of being transformed more easily. We know that very young children can learn a second language more easily than an adult. Young children can learn a musical instrument more easily than an adult. This is because the brain is more plastic early in life. And so we reasoned that perhaps we can introduce this kind of curriculum very, very early in preschool. This is with children 4 and 5 years of age. And if we can do that, maybe we can develop healthier habits of mind from the start, from very, very early, that then would be more enduring. And so we developed a curriculum that we call a kindness curriculum that includes both mindfulness and kindness practices designed for this age group. These are some of the things that are done each week. We have activities where they have to work out problems between themselves after they've calmed down. There are specific practices for gratitude where they express their gratitude. There's a week that we do on interconnectedness between all the children and their teachers and the planet. And we end with caring for the world. What we see in our initial studies is that the participants who are here in blue, as they go through this 8 weeks of training, and it's 90 minutes a week for 8 weeks, the reports of their teachers of their prosocial behavior. Prosocial behavior refers to cooperation, sharing, kindness to other children. Their teacher reports of prosocial behavior goes up in the group that receives this curriculum compared to a control group that just gets the standard curriculum. On a measure of attention, where the children here are asked to focus on the fish right in the center and to press a key that is an arrow key that's pointing in the same direction as this fish in the middle. But you can see that in this case, there are distracting fish that are on either side that are pointing in the opposite direction. So this is a measure of attention, and it's a certain kind of measure of self-discipline. And what we find is that after this 2 months of this kindness curriculum, the children who receive this curriculum actually are more accurate, and they perform this task more quickly. Their reaction time actually goes down, meaning that they're performing it both quickly and more accurately. Then we also give them a task that measures their sharing. And the way we do this is we give the children a bunch of stickers, which are very important for children who are 4 and 5 years of age. And we find out from each child by a survey that we do who the child's best friend is in the class. We also learn who the child's least favorite person is in the class. And we get pictures of each of those 2 children, and we place one picture on one envelope, another picture on another envelope. On a third envelope, this is just used to express what we're doing. It's not an actual picture. We put a picture of a child that they've never seen before, a stranger child. And in the last category, we have a picture of an obviously sick-looking child. And then we ask the child to please distribute the stickers according to who they wish to give them to. And before the training, the children give most of their stickers to their best friend. And they give very few stickers to anyone else. After the training, they are showing an equitable distribution across the board. They give an equal number of stickers to each of these different categories, to the friend, to the non-friend, to the stranger, and to the sick child, after just 2 months of this curriculum. So these findings are, I want to emphasize that we're still very much in the early stages. This is a very small, modest step, but it suggests that this kind of training can really begin at the very earliest period of schooling and may show some benefit. So to summarize, the core elements that we can glean from this neuroscientifically inspired work is that basic goodness is innate, and it has origins in our non-human primate ancestors. Knowledge that the brain is highly plastic can help to cultivate the aspiration for change. If each of us knows that we have a brain that can change, that can help actually give people an inspiration and an aspiration to actually change. And we have actually found this in our work, that just that knowledge is important. Finally, neuroscience and contemplative traditions converge around the idea of practice. And I think this is such an important element. And it is only through systematic practice, regular, repeated familiarization, that neuroplasticity can actually be induced. And related to that, I would just like to end and first express a very deep bow of gratitude to all the people that actually do this work in our group and our collaborators. I want to end with something that Your Holiness has said in the book, The Art of Happiness, where you said that the systematic training of the mind, the cultivation of happiness, the genuine inner transformation by deliberately selecting and focusing on positive mental states and challenging negative mental states is possible because of the very structure and function of the brain. But the wiring in our brains is not static, not irrevocably fixed. Our brains are also adaptable. Thank you very much.
강을 고마트를 캐서로 굶지 거 같으면 그 죽인 돼야지. 제가 그 굶지 된다. 다 제공 chen 굶지 된다 지고 등지 상담 그래야지. 단 제공은 뭐지? 조금 chen 그 굶지 된 거. 그래서 그 레벨을 주어서 개발하는 나서
Miss Owens was saying that a question occurred to him listening to your point about the need for constant cultivation and familiarity to induce neuroplasticity. And so from the kind of the classical Indian point of view, when we talk about familiarization process, there could be two...
I think our daily sort of experience, this is more familiar, then it automatically will come our mind without difficulties. So, because of the brain, also some changing.
Yes.
Now, you see, there are two kinds. One, this is simply some kind of faith, no reason, constantly thinking that. So that object or that thing becomes very familiar in your mind through that way. So that's one. Another analyze, investigate. We call analytical meditation.
Yes.
Through that way, familiarize. Methods different.
Yes.
But its familiarization is more or less same.
Yes.
So any differences?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. We do not know the answer to that, Your Holiness. It's a very important question, and that is something that we need to study and investigate. We do not know the answer. My intuition, just as a scientist, is that the analytic investigation will, I think it will recruit other parts of the brain, and because it will recruit those other parts of the brain, it may have a more enduring benefit. But we don't know that from a scientific perspective at this point.
Yes. Logically, through analytical meditation, brings deeper awareness. That brings conviction. Just familiarize. Yes, become familiar, but not conviction.
Yeah. I think it's important.
Okay. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes.
Just a follow-up question. In a sense, there is conditioning, and you can condition a mind negatively or positively. And in some sense, we are conditioning positively, but it's still conditioning. The other, which is more like analytical, is to be awake, to be intelligent and alert at all times, not form a habit. So one is formation of good habits. The other is not to have any habits at all, which is you are just awake. And then, as in the morning, when you have to be violent or not in physical terms and distinction, because the world will be constantly changing. And if we condition even positively, so-called, we have situations where that may become an inappropriate response. But if the only ability we gain is to just to be, that's why perhaps the Buddha is called the awakened one, which is different slightly from the good one, and that perhaps is more like the analytical part, rather than just focus and be conditioned.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful point, and I would agree with you that it's likely that those are different processes. It may be that the positive conditioning is an important step to becoming condition-free, if you will, or to be awake in the way that you're describing. But again, I would have to plead ignorance in terms of science. We just have not investigated this scientifically, and it's, I think it's a very important issue. One of the things that your point raises is the ability to rapidly transition to respond skillfully to whatever is occurring in one's environment. And this quality of being able to rapidly shift in a way that is appropriate to whatever is in front of you is something that I think is really very important. One of the things that we talk about in our lab is stickiness. So if you're, for example, if you have emotions which persist beyond the point where they're useful, they then can interfere with your ability to deal with whatever comes next. And that is a kind of emotional stickiness. And individuals who have gone through certain kinds of contemplative training, we find are able to exhibit this flexibility where they can respond more appropriately to whatever the task is at hand, and have less of this quality of stickiness, particularly emotional stickiness.
Before opening it up, I think I'd just like to ask Professor Davidson, just some questions or clarifications. I was just wondering that do you agree that personality, individual personality and the psyche are individual in as much as we all come from different socio-cultural, religious, ethnic backgrounds? And in that sense, some of the families or communities, especially of those who've experienced war, conflict, the Holocaust, or war in any way, they tend to cultivate fear and otherness in their children because they themselves have been victims. And we see this in India because a lot of work has been done on the partition of India and Pakistan and on the survivors of partition, and then the kind of trauma that they experienced and how that's passed on to the next generation. So I was wondering, in this wonderful, very powerful talk that you gave us of your work and the impact on young children, whether these kind of cultural, socio-cultural, religious, ethnic differences actually create barriers to the cultivation of compassion. I mean, is that something that was not germane to your study, or is that something that you did consciously look out for and see whether kids from very different kind of socio-economic, especially those from war and conflict situations, would have a different path, would follow a different path or not? And a connected question is something similar to what Professor Suneja said, except he sees this also as a form of conditioning. But my question is that a lot of your work is with very young children. And I think I asked this question last time His Holiness was here as well, that we are going to be working with older children, young adults. And it's successful because of the nature of the mind is so unconditioned at that age, at the preschool and the very young age. Whereas we are burdened already with so much knowledge, and what we think and young people also think is the right and wrong and so on. So how then is it going to work in quite the same way as it seems so successful, where you see the brain plasticity actually working? How is it going to work with an older, it's the next generation or the third, from that?
Well, wonderful questions. Thank you for asking them. Let me take the first question first in terms of war and conflict and social class and those kinds of issues. We're now doing research with young children in public schools in Madison, Wisconsin, and we have intentionally gone into the schools that have children from the poorest neighborhoods, the lowest socioeconomic status. In several of the schools that we're working in, 75% of the families qualify for food stamps, so that they don't have enough money to buy food to sustain them, so they get assistance for the purchase of food. And one of the things that we found actually is that those children are unusually receptive and dramatically affected by this kind of curriculum because it provides a safe haven for them that they don't get to experience very often. And so I actually think that we will see, and some of the early work suggests this, that the magnitude of change that we see produced by this seems to be greater in those children than children from a middle or upper middle class background, because they start off in a much more difficult situation. So, I think it's going to be interesting as we go along, but these are not children who've experienced war. These are children who've experienced poverty. And so it may be somewhat different for individuals who've really been in a conflict situation. We are doing other kinds of work with returning veterans in the United States who've recently come back from Afghanistan, who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's been a really very difficult challenge. And those individuals have such hyper-arousal in their bodies that one of the things we're finding is that before any contemplative practices of the sort that we're describing can be introduced, we need to help produce some quiescence of their body, a kind of autonomic balance. And so we're using some breathing exercises that actually come from yoga traditions to help them initially, and that seems to be something that's been effective. Regarding your second question, in terms of university students, one of the things that we've learned in neuroscience is that there are periods of important milestones for neural development. One of them is in the early infancy period. Another is right around the onset of schooling, between the ages of 5 and 7 years. And a third is right around adolescence, extending into late adolescence. It is a period of dramatic reorganization of the brain. There are certain systems that come online. And so I actually think from a neuroscientific perspective, working with university students, particularly in their first year, when they're still yes, that is a potentially optimal period because certain regulatory systems of the brain are first coming online. And it's true, they've been exposed to a huge amount before that. But in our experience, it's also a time of opportunity where they're willing to try new things, explore. There's a sense of curiosity and investigation, and a kind of internal sense that their minds and their bodies are going through a lot of change. And so I think that it is a potentially opportune time. But again, there's been so little research from a scientific perspective that we just don't know at this point, and we need to try. We need to try different things and see what works best.
Professor Chandna?
My question is rather similar to Meenakshi's, but in a different way. I was just wondering if these changes that come up once, how persistent are they and what is their resilience in the face of, say, trauma? Now, supposing you have been positively attuned and then you come across a very negative situation. So what, has anything been done in that regard, any experimentation? Like that, instead of preceding war, it can be war or crime or trauma that comes later, after you have received this.
Yeah, wonderful question. The most honest answer is we don't know. There's been so little research that has investigated the longer-term changes. But one of the things that I frequently use as an analogy when I'm asked a question like that is physical exercise. If someone who was not in very good physical shape went to a 1 or 2 month training program to engage in physical exercise to help condition their body, and then they stopped exercising for the rest of their life, we wouldn't expect that the benefits of that program would persist for very long. And I think the same thing is true with training the mind. That if we engage in a program for several weeks or several months, there's no likelihood, I think, based on everything that we know, that it will endure unless the individuals continue to practice in some way. And so that is the only way that these qualities, I think, can really become enduring.
I would ask some students to ask questions. Yes?
Sir, I had a question. It is true, like you said, that young kids have the most impressionable minds, and the best way to reach out to young kids is at school. But not all kids are fortunate enough to be in school, and how do we then take the responsibility of positively influencing the minds of these kids who are completely left out of the purview of this program?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and I'm not sure I know the answer to that. One of the things that we're trying to do is to reach out to the parents of these children and to implement programs for the parents in addition to for the children. And I should also mention, particularly after Arthur's beautiful talk this morning and discussion related to that is we also provide a program for the teachers before we do anything for the children. So the teachers go through 10 weeks of training themselves before we bring any kind of curriculum to the children. But I think that your question is really a critical one. And many of these kids that we're working with, particularly children from impoverished backgrounds, come from families that are very, very stressed, where many of them are single-parent families, where the mother typically is caring for the child, and the mother may have 2 jobs in order to make ends meet and to get enough money to support her children. And for us to ask them to come to some kind of program would create more stress in their life. And it's been very difficult. And we're exploring ways, working with community organizations in their communities, to see if we can reach out to them, even if it's more irregular, to at least familiarize them with some of the elements that their children are being exposed to. But it's a very difficult problem, and I don't think any of us scientists really have the answer at all.
Question? Yes, Ritu. Sorry. Next. You have some?
Yes. No, that's it. 第二个，第三说的，the traumatic side 话，这个怕嘛的刚才猜的比呢，因为不属于刚才的，别说的。第不，看到不，其实打马出来光了呀，他是说的爱呢。是，其实打出来这里，哎呢，不，俺们讲呢，就是怕没刚才的累呢。 저 그 소소 샘그 쬐셔셔도 피지컬 간에 쬐시도 그 쉐도 아유 삼천서. 그 인베 좀 제직디 배나 강의 영에 배나 넘겨내 셔야 돼. 배나 지 골락나 되네. 강의 영에 찍어야지. 이렇게 드라마틱 쉬우시도 가. 가시 민도 가. 그 리뷰 차는 찍번요 뭐. 이네 삼루 동서 차네 찍는 드라마틱 민도 봐. 찍는 영데. 그래서 뒤 그 가서 안 되면은 가서래. 파마강에 쉬우시 차이지 뭐 있나? 뒤부 부규리 되지 어디 시험서. 그래서 좀
His Holiness is responding partly, but also raising a question about the point you made, Professor Thaban, about the kind of transference of traumatic experience from parents to the children. And in this regard, His Holiness, his own sense is that probably this kind of trauma can only be transferred only after a kind of a socialization and verbalization, because he can't imagine that kind of trauma being transferred to children during a pre-verbal stage. So that means it is a kind of a socialization process that occurs. And so in that case, then it has a lot to do with actual thought processes, where children learn to think. It has to do with socialization, it has to do with conscious thought processes, which are then internalized. So therefore, the trauma may be later express itself physically, but initially the acquisition of that would be more mental. And the point that His Holiness is making is that often you see among people who come out of very traumatic experiences, like people who have spent time in Gulag, in prison, as a political prisoner, and then coming out of that, some individuals come out completely destroyed with traumatic experience, and some individuals seem to be quite unscathed. And that difference has to do with the kind of attitude these people had and the kind of resilience they were able to bring. So again there, from the physical experience point of view, the people had the same experience.
Although there is research that indicates that the trauma can be passed from the mother to the child before the child acquires language. So for example, in the first year of life, when a child between birth and 12 months, before language emerges, if a mother is depressed, shows clinical depression. The child's brain is actually affected, and their behavior that can be discerned through adolescence. And so this is an event which occurs clearly before language has been acquired. Yeah.
And there's even...
depression
and there's even research, new research on epigenetics, which show that stress of a mother can affect the expression of genes in the babies in the womb over several generations. So they have done this in rats, and several generations of rats carry the memory of the stress of the mother many generations before through a mechanism which affects the expression of genes. So that is a very, very unverbal and preconscious transmission of trauma or stress.
I think I was...
Then things become more complicated.
Yeah.
I think present generation will really facing some problem. So your children, grandchildren, I think carry these kind of problems. So for the time being, I think this century almost no hope.
My question was actually in the context of verbal and transference of trauma, where young children are taught or told that we are Hindus and they are Muslims, and we have this kind of past, and our people were killed in this way. And that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And so children imbibe this. And also there's also a work with the Tibetan youth, Hani Wali's book, which talks about Tibetan youth in exile who have carry so much hurt and memory of the trauma which their parents and grandparents have experienced, and which they continue to experience in exile.
Yeah,
that there is a way in which I wonder how this is going to
it's a great question, and I think these are deep kinds of prejudices that are developed as a consequence of the kinds of experiences that you're describing, and that produce habits of mind that are very difficult to change. But there is new research, for example, on racial prejudice in the United States, where a person can fill out a questionnaire and say, oh, I'm not prejudiced at all. And yet, on certain kinds of more objective measures, they clearly show some bias. And there are ways of training to help reduce that bias. And one of the ways that actually has been examined, where there has been some success, is actually through certain kinds of prosocial video games, where teenagers play games that are designed to counteract these racial stereotypes. And there's been some success. And so I think that we need to think out of the box in many different ways, and I think that we need to bring every avenue that we can to bear on this kind of training. And I think that we should bring the best that Western science has to offer, as well as the ancient contemplative traditions.
Are there any other questions? Okay, quick.
I thought contemplation is about not being quick, being calm. My question is of two kinds. Since the University of Delhi proposes to introduce this program, and clearly it's written, the systematic training of the mind, my question is, what kind of a mind would have to impart the systematic training of the mind? what kind of a mind is needed to impart systematic training of the mind. And how are we going to create the minds? Last time when I was here, His Holiness was here, and I asked this question to him. I said, who will teach the course? And he looked at me and he said, you will teach the course. So that brings back this question, very important one.
Yeah. Well, it's a wonderful and critical question, and I think that this is a big problem, and I don't think there are any easy answers, and I think that it clearly, from everything we know about this kind of practice, individuals who embody these qualities are really important in being able to, you can't instruct others in these kinds of traditions unless you embody the qualities yourself. And as a consequence, I think that universities need to be open to hiring people to teach these kinds of courses who may not be people with PhDs. And they may be people who just have these kind of qualities and are able to teach them, but they may not be traditional academics. And I think that one of the things that we're seeing is, at least in the United States, an increased receptivity where universities are willing to bring on these kinds of people as adjunct staff members to help teach these kinds of courses that would normally not be a professor at a university. We heard last night about academic senate meetings or faculty meetings. The pro-vice chancellor was telling us that went on all night and may not be the epitome of emotional intelligence. I think that we need to find the right people.
May I close this session now with a big thanks to Richard Davidson for his very powerful and I think we have a lot to learn from many of the things that he told us about. I now invite you all for a cup of tea outside and come back quickly for the following session. Thank you so much.
Welcome to the final session for the day. And I'm going to request Professor Subhadra Charna to introduce the two speakers, and we look forward to this session.
Thank you, Vivekji. Well, in this session, we have a double pleasure, whatever you may call it. We have two speakers, not one. The first one of them is Tanya Singer. She's right here. She is from Munich, Germany, and she studied psychology at the Philipps University of Marburg. And then she did her PhD from the Free University of Berlin, and continued to work at the Max Planck Institute as a research scientist at the Center for Lifespan Psychology. In 2010, she became a director at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive and Brain Sciences in Leipzig, Germany. In 2011, she received an honorary professorship from the University of Leipzig, Germany, and the Humboldt University, Berlin. She is also an honorary research fellow at the Laboratory for Social and Neural Systems Research at the University of Zurich. Tanya Singer's work examines human social behavior using an interdisciplinary approach. In particular, her work focuses on social cognition, social moral emotions such as empathy, compassion, envy, and fairness, social decision-making, and communication. She is interested in the determinants of cooperation and prosocial behavior, as well as the breakdowns of cooperation and the emergence of selfish behavior. Singer is at present a fellow at the Mind and Life Institute and has worked with the French Buddhist monk Matthew Ricard to investigate brain activity during meditation. Actually, it's a very long CV. I'm not reading the whole of it. Sorry, Tanya. And our second speaker, equally distinguished, is Thupten Jinpa, right here. He has been the principal English translator to the Dalai Lama since 1985. As you can see that he has been practicing his skills here too. He was born in Tibet in 1958. He received his early education and training as a monk at Dzongkar Chodi Monastery in South India, and later joined the Shastri College of Ganden Monastic University in South India, where he received the Geshe Laram degree. He taught Buddhist epistemology, metaphysics, middle way philosophy, and Buddhist psychology at Ganden for 5 years. Jinpa also holds a BA Honours degree in Western philosophy and a PhD degree in religious studies, both from Cambridge University, UK. He was the Margaret Smith Research Fellow in Eastern Religion at Girton College, Cambridge, and has now established the Institute of Tibetan Classics, where he is both president and editor-in-chief of the Institute's translation series, Classics in Tibet. He is also a member of the advisory board of the Mind and Life Institute, dedicated to fostering creative dialogue between the Buddhist tradition and Western science. He is a visiting research scholar at the Stanford Institute for Neuroinnovation and Translational Neurosciences at Stanford University, and obviously he is the author of many important books. So I invite both of them, and they will speak one after the other. First Tanya, and then Thupten. And
thank you very much for this kind introduction, and it's an honor to speak here today. So what I thought I will do is to follow up on the footsteps of what Richie Davidson was talking, and it's the topic of neuroplasticity. So I first wanted to show you an example of a secular mental training program which is conceived for a 1-year training. So it's not 8 weeks or 3 months, but it's a 1-year training, and it's just an example of how you can use and train very different sets of skills, and how these different sets of skills have actually very different neural underpinnings in the brain. So I want to talk about that. I want to talk about especially training empathy and compassion, and I want to tell you about the difference between these two seemingly like concepts and show you that they're actually very different. And then at the end, I'll just give you some example or thoughts of training programs, but Jimpa will lead you into an 8-week compassion training program step by step in much more detail. So I focus more on the scientific part of this. So this training program, which has inspired the work I will show you, is called Research Project and has been granted by the European Research Council, so by the European Union. And the goal is to actually study the effects of very different kind of mental training on brain health, subjective well-being, and different forms of behavior. So that's the goal of the bigger study. And here are what the three module or the 3 domains which are trained. So we call it, one domain is presence, the other affective, and the other perspective. Let me tell you why we do this distinction between these 3 main modules. Each of the training module goes about 3 months. And so the first module, the first module is focusing on training what Richie has already talked about. It's attentional skills. So it's like bringing your attention back into the present moment, to be really here, not to have your mind in the past or future, but really be here. And then another part of the first block is to train interoceptive awareness. And interoceptive awareness is really getting familiar with your body signals and with what is going on inside of your body. So it's to embody basically cognition. The second part, and Jimpa will tell you much more about that in a very concrete way, how you can train that, is we called it affective because it's basically aiming at opening the heart. So the goal is to teach capacities like loving kindness, compassion, prosocial motivation, but also to teach how to cope with afflictive emotion. What do you do if you are angry or you are stressed? You cannot open your heart if you are stressed or angry, so what do you do then? And the other one is more a cognitive module. It's also 3 months, and it's complementing the other, but it is less emotional and affective in nature, and it has more to do with understanding, with getting a perspective on your mind, so you learn to observe your thoughts, and also to get a perspective on self. The question which you are asking here is, who am I? Who is the self? What is the self? And to get a better understanding of aspects of self and how these aspects color your perception of world and reality. And then another aspect of this training module is to take the cognitive perspective of another. And I will tell you in a moment why we distinguish empathy from cognitive perspective taking. So, you might ask yourself, why these differences? Why cognitive affective? Is that just philosophically? Is it a concept? But I will tell you in a minute that there is a reality in the brain which has taught us to distinguish these aspects. So insights from social neuroscience. Social neuroscience is asking the question, how do my mind understand other minds? How do I come to understand other people even though I'm not in the other person? I'm not the other person. So how do I manage this problem? And a lot of research in the last years has identified different pathways or different ways and routes how you can understand other minds. There is one which is more affective and the other is more cognitive. So the more affective route is sharing feelings and states with others through empathy or through compassion. So let me tell you the difference now already conceptually between the concept of empathy and the concept of compassion, how we use it. So empathy is I share your feelings, so the capacity to get in resonance with your feeling. So if you are in pain, I'm in pain. If you are in joy, I'm in joy. And you call it empathic joy or empathic pain. But I basically know it's not my feeling. So I know it's your feeling, but I'm vicariously sharing this feeling. But this is not a good or a bad thing. It's just the resonance between us. Now, compassion is different. And I will show you data to show that if you train empathy or compassion, you activate completely different networks, even though they seem to be so similar. Compassion is that you have a feeling for a person which is concern and comes out of what we call the caring affiliative system, is actually a rather warm system close to love and a strong motivation to help the other. So empathy in itself doesn't mean that you want to help the other. You don't have necessarily a motivation, you just share the pain with the other. So then, this is one route how you can understand feeling emotional states with others. And then there is another route which we call cognitive perspective taking. It has also been called theory of mind. And you can imagine, for example, psychopaths. Psychopaths lack the affective route. They cannot feel empathy and compassion, but they are very good in understanding what another person thinks. They're very good in manipulating the other person, understanding the mind, thoughts of the other people. But that's a cognitive understanding. It's not feeling the pain of the other. And this distinction converges to a distinction of networks in the brain. So what is shown here in green in the brain is a network which is always activated if you do cognitive understanding of other people's mind. And the red one, the yellow, the orange one, in the brain, the pathway, is underlying empathy and compassion. And these two different networks usually interact, they work together, but they develop at different times. So for example, the cognitive perspective network develops much later in childhood than the limbic structures which subserve empathy and compassion. So they have different developmental origins. Okay. Now let me tell you that even in this affective module, you can distinguish between different phenomena like empathy and compassion. And a lot of research in early days of social neuroscience have asked the question, how can I share pain with others? If someone is in pain, how do I feel the pain? And they have put this hypothesis forward and said, is it true that when I observe someone, for example, in pain, that I automatically activate neural network in myself which process my own pain? So I relive, I simulate the pain of others. And this is how we tested it in the lab, you know. So this is just a very bad movie, but it gives you an impression. You know, someone is lying here with pain electrodes and will get pain soon on the hand. And the husband is sitting next to the scanner. This is a brain imaging scanner. And, you know, I will receive pain and I will be scanned so that my brain will be scanned. Now I'm like, ouch, I get pain, but very short. And then my husband sometimes gets pain, but I don't feel anything. I just know he is suffering now. And now I can compare brain responses when I get pain and when I know the other is in pain and suffering. And what you find again and again, even if you show faces of pain, is overlaps. So the green area is when I really get pain. This is when my brain is in pain, is feeling pain. And the red area on top of it is the area which gets active also when I just know another person is in pain. So what it tells us is that we share the suffering of others by activating neural network in our brains which process our own pain. But it's not conscious always. Sometimes we don't know. If you would ask, what is your brain doing, I would know. So now the next step, we ask, is it a good thing to train empathy? Is it good to have empathy for the world? Does it increase prosocial behavior? And what is the difference between empathy and compassion? And this question came really about because we did research with Mathieu Ricard, who is a long-term meditator, and whenever he went into compassion, we did not see the pain network lighting up. We saw something else lighting up. And so we started understanding that it has to be very different things. So what we did is to get a model and to say, perhaps it's like that. We have the capacity to go in empathy with others, to feel what other people are feeling, to go in resonance. But this can turn into what is called empathic distress or personal stress. So if you have too much empathy, you share too much pain, it can become a very self-centered emotion and can lead to negative feelings and on the long run to poor health and burnout. And you know, perhaps in helping profession, a lot of people kill themselves, they make suicide. And that's a big problem, and that's probably because they don't know how to transform empathy into compassion, how to basically develop compassion, which is really about the other. It's rather a warm feeling of concern and motivation to help. So now what we did is to train like Richie said it, and so I go very fast here because it's very similar to the study which he presented, where you have 1 week of training in people like me and you, who have not practiced a long time before, and we train one group in memory, just mental skill, which is cognitive is memory, and one in loving kindness. And then we scan the brains of people while we show them movies of news, you know, like the terrible suffering you see in the world in news, in BBC video clips. And so people are exposed to tremendous suffering in the world. And now we scan the brain and ask them, how much negative affect and how much warm and positive feeling do you feel when you see this? And before training, people you see in the brain the whole pain and alarm network going on, and they say very negative, I feel very distressed and negative. Now we train them 1 week in loving kindness and compassion and how to use that to confront suffering. And they show, you see, before and after training, they still show negative affect. They are not suppressing the negative affect, but they show now an increase in reported subjective warmth and positive and concern. So this is the increase left. So that was astonishing because it was very strong material, and still after a week they could respond differently to this distressing material. And when we looked into the brain of these people, a new network came active, something which we had not seen before. And you see Mathieu Ricard on the right, which is our expert, and we had studied him a long time, often. And even for a non-neuroscientist, you can see it's the same network. It's exactly the same network, just that experts show it much stronger. And it's a network which is associated to affiliation and to positive feeling and reward. So His Holiness said in the morning that, that compassion is rooted in mother-child interaction and in the love a mother gives to the child. And this network, which is activated through loving-kindness training, is exactly the network you find when you, for example, show mothers the pictures of their newborn babies. It's an affiliating, caring network. So that was very interesting. And what we did now, to go deeper into the difference between empathy and compassion, is to train another group, first in empathy. So we said, imagine also suffering. Visualize a suffering person, but just suffer, just feel the suffering on your body, and don't do anything else, just resonate with the suffering. And then a week later, with the same person, we teach them loving kindness practice, and say, try to develop the caring warmth and this loving motivation to hold. And now I show you the results of the brain in a single same person after 1 week of empathy and 1 week of compassion. And you see the blue areas in the brain is the increase in activation after 1 week of empathy training. And it's the same pain-related area I showed you before in the empathy for pain, when you really get pain. So we sensitized people to actually activate negative affect and pain after empathy training. And then a week later, we reverse this effect. And you see the red area is the network I showed you, which is a positive, affiliative reward network. And they don't overlap at all, these networks. So in the same person, you can activate very different circuitries and very different emotions. And what is astonishing is the same pictures come into the brain, so they are exposed always to the same videos. Okay, so what we could also show, and Richie said that already, we are using also video games to measure prosocial behavior in the lab. And here this is a Pac-Man game, and so you can see whether other people help other Pac-Mans in this video game, or whether they just go for their treasure and their money and they don't help. And what we could see after 1 week of compassion, loving kindness training, but not after memory training, you increased the percentage of helping other people when they were, trapped in games. It's a game, but people really play it, it's really tapping on our system. So this is basically saying that this model seems to be true on the first levels, is that after compassion and loving kindness training, you cultivate positive, warm emotion of concern. We know from other research that stress level go down, so that health increases. And if you go too strongly in empathy, you run the danger to burn out if you have standalone empathy, if you cannot transform it into compassion, which we showed in this other training study. So just to complete this little excursus, I just remind you again, I have now told you only a little bit, out of all this capacity you can train. So I just showed you basically within the affective block the difference between compassion and empathy training. Now you can imagine that every of these muscles, or every of these cognitive processes can be trained differently and result in activation in different network in the brain. So if you compose your training program for the university, you have to think, what do you want to give these people at hand? Do you want to train attention, or more affective capacity, or more, wisdom aspects, understanding, self? And depending on what you think is good, you can do it sequentially or so, it will activate and induce different brain plasticity. So this is basically just how different exercises could be, but I'm not leading you into the exercises here. The only thing perhaps worth mentioning, and Jimpala will go much more in detail in that, is that you can use classical meditation exercise, but these programs also have developed a lot of new ways of exercising the mind. So for example, this below is an exercise we call contemplative diet. It's like loud meditation. You speak out your mind loudly, and someone is listening, and so in your eyes, and so there is an intersubjectivity which is trained as well. But it's not chit-chatting. It's like one is responding on a question and the other is listening. And then you turn. It's like a very formal practice, but which practice intersubjectivity and shared humanity too. So that's just an example to perhaps foster. We found 20 teachers which we could teach in these programs, so I'm sure that you could do the same here in Delhi. This was in Berlin, and they are now all basically trained to kind of teach these programs, so you just have to start somewhere, and then it works. Yeah, they come. And that's just to remind you, that's the overall model, of research you could perhaps apply to evaluate the training here, is to basically measure genes and environment to see how does that affect how people differentially profit from training, how does this training affect brain, and how does that affect subjective well-being, health, and behavior. So that's the flow of how you could evaluate your training and also think about measures you could devise. Yes? So that's the people behind the research, which have a big thank you in Germany, and that's the names. Thank you very much.
I now invite Jimpala.
Your Holiness, Pro Vice Chancellor Professor Suneja, Your Excellency Dr. Lobsangye, distinguished faculty members and students of Delhi University. It's both a pleasure and also a great honor for me to be included in this particular dialogue on science, ethics, and education. And especially for someone like myself who grew up in India as a child and received formal monastic training in one of the major Tibetan monastic universities in South India, to be able to be included in this important conversation here taking place in Delhi University, which is really aimed at exploring creative and contemporary ways in which many of the core human values and age-old wisdoms, which really characterize the heart of Indic classical civilization, can be brought alive among the younger generation of this country, a country that we Tibetans have always referred to as the land of the noble ones, Aryavarta. So it's a particular honor for me to be part of this conversation, and it was wonderful to listen to the opening remarks from the Vice Chancellor and also Pro Vice Chancellors, as spelling out the vision that Delhi University has. And also I was particularly touched by the deep affection that His Holiness seems to really feel for this particular university. This is the first time I have been able to personally witness this, so I was deeply moved. And I feel, as someone who has served His Holiness for so many years, I also would like to share with you that I feel that I'm sure you're all, aware. I feel you ought to feel privileged and fortunate. I've been asked to speak about a program that I was involved at Stanford University. My talk will be very different from all the preceding presentations. As you can kind of guess from my bio, I'm not a scientist. In fact, in terms of modern education, His Holiness made the comment earlier about his lack of exposure to modern education. I had a little bit, but I left school after grade 4 to join a monastery. So I have very little modern education as a background. My own formal training is in classical monastic education. So I have to warn you that my slides will not be as interesting as the scientist with the beautiful graphs and colors. I'm more of a traditional humanities scholar, so there will be quite a lot of text, so please bear with me. In Arthur's presentation, he really presented this big picture and also gave you a sense of the kind of movement that is taking place in North America, particularly, as well as Europe and other parts, but primarily in North America, where in the higher education centers, there's a genuine eagerness to try to bring something within the education environment in terms of what one could call the development of the heart. And His Holiness often talks about cultivation of the warm heart. In both Richie and Tanya's presentation, one thing that became very clear is the discovery of the plasticity, neuroplasticity of brain, and what it means for us as individual human beings, and also for the larger society, if we can able to tap into this and catalyze in a constructive way. And one of the things that also came through very clearly is the kind of work that is resulting through the interaction between neuroscientists like Richie and Tanya and others, and also contemplative scholars, like John Dunn, Matthew Ricca, and here we have Dr. Losantenzi Negi, and others who have been part of this conversation, which Mind and Life has really kind of pioneered, and the kind of new research that Richie and Tanya has presented. And in fact, people call it contemplative neuroscience. I don't know whether that term will take off, but it is an interesting new field which has really emerged through the conversation and interaction between these two intellectual investigative traditions. And in one sense, I feel privileged to be part of this conversation and dialogue, not because I had something very special to offer, but I got really dragged into this by virtue of the fact that I've been honored to serve His Holiness as his principal interpreter. So I think it is important development, and I think the larger societal implications of what this new kind of science and contemplative interaction may hold for larger humanity, only time can tell. But to date, the results have been very, very constructive and very encouraging and inspiring to some extent. So with that preliminary comments, I will specifically focus on the presentation on what we call CCT. It stands for Compassion Cultivation Training. This was developed at Stanford Center of Compassion, which is part of the Stanford Neuroscience Institute, which has a very long name, but it's essentially Stanford Neuroscience Institute, which is part of the Stanford Medical School. And I was privileged to be part of a group there. And in fact, the establishment of the center there has been directly inspired by His Holiness's larger vision for humanity. And it's an attempt on the part of some of the key members at Stanford to try to really take up the challenge that His Holiness has posed in terms of articulating his larger vision for humanity. And in fact, before we established the center, a core team of the Stanford group had an audience with His Holiness in Seattle. And at that meeting, His Holiness made 2 points. He said, I don't know if Your Holiness will remember, His Holiness said, I have two requests. He said, one, whatever science you do, it has to be impeccable, highest standard, rigorous. And second, he said, whatever training you may develop, it needs to be completely secularized. No backdoor Buddhism, completely secularized and universalizable. And we really took those advice to heart. And CCT really came out of this. It's an attempt to really take from the contemplative Indo-Tibetan tradition, meditation and contemplative practices, but really develop it in a very contemporary way that would make it as much as possible universalizable and secular. So it is an 8-week course with a 2-hour in-person class once a week, so we meet once a week. And it's not an undergraduate course, although we do have an undergraduate course version of this. But this is just a course developed for ordinary person. And then it's complemented by 20 to 30-minute recorded guided daily meditation at home. So once people sign up for the course, they have to attend once a week, 2-hour class. And then from the first day, they have to start meditating on a daily basis by listening to an MP3 recorded. And then on top of that, we have another element which we call informal practices. And this is directly inspired from a line from one of the Tibetan Lojong teachings where it says that whatever you encounter, bring it into your practice, meditation practice. So it's an attempt to, for example, it's very demanding for ordinary average person to find the time to sit quietly for half an hour. But everybody drives around, takes the train, metro, whatever it is, and then you can occasionally take 2 or 3 minutes while you are commuting and simply use that opportunity to look at other person who's in front of you and try to imagine what it must feel like to be that other person. This is kind of cognitive empathy training. So these are what we call informal practices. And then the class is taught by, of course, a trained instructor. And the in-person class consists of pedagogy, which is instruction, and then a group discussion, and then at least there is 40 minutes of guided meditation in the class itself on the relevant theme. And then we have interactive exercises, which is essentially the same as what Tanya was talking about. Tanya calls it contemplative diet, and yesterday we were talking about it, and I've probably changed the phrase to now intersubjective exercises. I think probably that's a better term. Thank you, Tanya. So now what are the aims of this particular program that we developed? And the idea is to become more aware of and connected with our caring and compassionate nature. So Tanya spoke about this affiliative caring system within the brain, and this sits very well with the basic Buddhist idea that compassion is innate to us, it's natural. We can also see in other mammals. And His Holiness often talks about the importance of awareness. You have to recognize it. So that aim is both to be aware and then to become connected. Another aim is to nurture this nature and develop it so that we can really make compassion not just a feeling state, but actually make it a perspective, an outlook, on life and the way we look at the world around us. And another aim which is related to the second one, then to learn to relate to ourselves, to others, and the world around us more from a place of understanding and compassion rather than from excessive negative judgment. So we would immediately, generally we tend to react to situations immediately from an excessive defensive judgment point of view. The idea here is to learn to respond more from an understanding and a compassionate standpoint. And then if the situation calls for a more harsher approach, as His Holiness suggested, then of course it's something else. And then eventually the idea is, this is again coming from the contemplative tradition, to really make compassion become part of your enduring character so that it comes effortlessly in response to any situations. So those are the aims. Of course, not everybody is going to get to the final objective, but that is the ideal. Now, then the question is, what do we mean by compassion, particularly in the context of our training? Because, although we all feel compassion in some degree, we So we all feel that, when we talk about compassion, we kind of know what it is. It's a bit like falling in love. We know what it feels like. But we all have different theories about it. So people have different views about what is compassion. So for the program, we make sure that there's at least a working definition of what we mean by compassion, so that everybody is roughly on the same sheet. So we understand compassion to be a multi-dimensional process. It's not just one thing, and it came through very clearly in Tanya's presentation. There were many different components. So there is an awareness of suffering of the other, which is a sort of a more cognitive dimension. There is a sympathetic concern, which is the more effective, empathetic dimension. You have to feel the other person's pain or at least some form of distress. And then the third element is wishing to see the relief of that perceived suffering. So this would be more of an intention, or it could be also more of a motivational component. And then it could, now in the basic definition of compassion, we don't bring in the actual active dimension of wanting to do something. Now in many cases, there might be the fourth element, which is a responsiveness or readiness to really help relieve that suffering. So then there is an action component. But at the basic level, compassion on its own need not necessarily be followed by that active wanting to do something. So there are three key elements as part of this package. One is what we call psychological education, and this is in some ways kind of attempting to what His Holiness was mentioning earlier about the need for some kind of internal map of mind. That is an attempt to present that. So the idea here is that the material is drawn from contemporary psychological sciences and to some extent from Buddhist psychology, but the language is completely contemporary psychology. We don't use Buddhist psychology language. To help develop greater awareness and understanding of our own mental processes, this involves some form of contemplative practice as well, like breathing and observing, and then dynamic relationships of our thoughts, attitudes, emotions, and actions. And here, one of the inspiration for this kind of module is the basic idea that is very present in Indo-Tibetan Buddhist tradition, where we talk about outlook, cultivation, and then behavior, action, and how your view, the way you see the world, your perception affects the kind of attitude you bring to the world. That together, in turn, shapes the way you actually experience the world. You experience the world differently, and your emotional experience of the world then affects your behavior. And there is a dynamic relationship. It's not simply a one-way, it's a circular, interlooping relationship, interconnected. So this is why we emphasize that. And then, of course, a key component is a contemplative practice in the form of guided meditation practices adapted from Indo-Tibetan compassion meditation practice. This is similar to what Richie presented, the different steps, loving kindness and compassion to a loved one, to oneself, to strangers, to a difficult person, and so on. So it's a steps. And unlike mindfulness meditation, this is completely guided, so which seems to work, more effectively for contemporary society, particularly the younger generation, because particularly in the West, people tend to be very active. So in the guided meditation, the advantage is at the most you have a silent period of not more than 2-3 minutes, so which makes it easier. And then the third element is intrasubjective, mostly dietic, not necessarily completely, but in our case. And these are adapted from contemporary therapeutic disciplines, such as nonviolent communication is one, and commitment and act therapy is another source. And here the idea is we don't rely entirely on contemplative practice of silent individual personal reflection, but also having these dietic exercises, looking into each other's eyes and sharing. And one of the typical, to give an example, when talking about empathy, to someone, the other two person, even we structure the position, the chair facing each other, and then one person asks the other person, now can you tell me something about yourself that you really feel good? Whether it's something that you did or whether something that that you really feel proud about in your life, whether it's a relationship or something. And then the person shares, and then the other person who's responding, listens mindfully, fully present, and intently. And when the other person finishes, you simply say, thank you for sharing that. And then you reverse. And it seems to be very powerful. So that's one of the third elements. So it's not contemplative practice alone. So in that respect, it's different from what you have studied, yeah. Now, sorry, yeah. So briefly, I'm not going to go into the step-by-step. Briefly, the program began in 2010. I was fortunate to be the main author of the program. I had 3 contributing authors: Kelly McGonigal at Stanford, Margaret Cullen is a therapist, and Erica Rosenberg works with Paul Ekman. She's a Paul Ekman's PhD student. And when the program was first launched, these 3 became the first senior instructors, and they gave a lot of courses. After a while, there was a lot of demand, so we needed a larger pool of teachers. So we then brought in 2 cohorts of senior instructors with a very extensive background, either in Tibetan or Theravada Buddhist meditation or Zen practice or yoga, and with some mostly PhDs in psychology or therapy. So we trained a 2 group of them, altogether about 8 people in 2. And then after that, just recently, we launched our first real teacher-instructor training course. We had a huge amount of applications, but we selected 48 out of that. And it's a 1-year program that does not presuppose any prior meditation experience. So that's why we had to keep the course very long, so that people start doing the practices every day from day 1 once they sign up, so that over a period of a year, they would have accumulated. And there will be a couple of interval intense retreats as well. So we have just started that course. And so far, the courses have been offered at Stanford, at Berkeley, to Stanford undergraduates for credits, which is a slightly different form. And at Google, we offered it, and to cancer support networks. And then a major private healthcare in San Diego called Sharp, which has about 15,000 employees. And they are going to formalize this as part of the medical professionals training there. And we have 2 senior instructors who are part of that group, which we trained. And then recently, we started also working with PTSD that you talked about, post-traumatic stress disorder. There is a major residential treatment center in Palo Alto, which is just next to Stanford. And we had offered 2 pilot courses, and in a much more intensive 6-week, because the residential period is only 7 weeks, so we had to finish it in 6 weeks. We have given 2 pilot courses, and so far the results are quite promising, to the point where now VA is thinking about actually scaling it up. And the Stanford Center has just recently been informed that there are going to be funding from the VA to really try to scale it up. And there seems to be very interesting results coming out. I'm not going to talk about the scientific studies that have been done, because they're very similar to what Richie and Tanya talked about, the effect on emotion regulation, effect on happiness, personal reporting of happiness, and particularly improvement in interpersonal relations, especially with the family members. So there seems to be a huge amount of positive benefits. I'm not a scientist, although my name has been on 2 of the publications that came out of this, but I'm not a researcher, so I'm not going to talk about something that I don't feel confident about, but I think they are very similar to what Richie and Tanya has talked about. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. So at the end of the day, we have got some very concrete, suggestions and, summing up of actual research that has been going on. Before I open this session for questions, I would request His Holiness to give his own comments. I would ask you a question. You know, when we are talking about training minds, is it possible to train every mind? Every mind? Or there would be some which would be, you know, untrainable or unreachable?
So basically, you know, one cannot really make any discriminations among individuals, some who can be trained and some who can't be trained. But of course,
I was talking of the actual practical possibilities that one could come again, because I'm talking of, say, we tried to train the students, and then some just refuse to get, you know, be involved or show interest. How do we go about it then?
I think that depends on teachers. If you try to impose, then I think some student, I think, loves against. So, if the teacher side to say, the clear presentation, do you like healthy body or not? I think nobody say no. Do you want more problem or no? I don't think anyone say, I want more problem. And do you need more friends, more trusted people or not? I think they will say, yes, I like. Do you need more sort of respect from others? Or all surrounding you sort of people, right? Surrounding people always suspect you. What do you prefer?
So it really depends upon how the instructor presents the material. You know, it needs to be related to the individual's experience and their aspiration in life.
Firstly, their day-to-day life. Then remaining their life. Unless you see some brain damage, then we have to ask those who scientists to some operation here.
Even with brain damage, though, there's evidence, for example, for patients who have had stroke, where there's clear, unambiguous damage, that the brain can still be trained, particularly the parts of the brain that are healthy can be retrained to assume some of the functions that were lost by the side that was damaged. So there's still a lot of possibility. And here again, I think it's very important for scientists in particular to say, we don't know. We have rarely pushed the limits of human plasticity. We do not know what the limits of human plasticity are. And so I think that these are very important questions that need to be addressed.
And perhaps one thing, I think what will be the future of the next years also of this kind of training research is to look for how individual differences predict a different learning in different programs. So, for example, Paul Gilbert, who is a clinical psychologist, and he works on compassion-based therapy, so with really disturbed persons therapy. But he always say that, for example, when people had trauma, or like the mother was whipped away or abuse, the affiliative system, which is trained through compassion, is hurt. And so when they get immediately confronted with loving kindness, no good, because they start, it hurts, and then they refute it. So, when you take this into account, you can start with another practice first, and then slowly, go step by step to look at this. And so I think the more and more we will understand which difference between people predict learning in different modules, you know, in different practices, the more we can shape the program so that they really work for individual, you know, lives. So, and I think we are just beginning to understand this.
John?
I really enjoyed the presentation, and so I'm thinking about something, and this comes from a very sympathetic perspective, but traditionally, ethics is sort of taught as rules that one should follow, the 10 Commandments, or even within the yoga tradition, learning the yamas and niyamas first, or the lila first. And what we're doing now is flipping the order of that. So in a sense, we're looking to see whether ethics can emerge from the bottom up instead of kind of coming from the top down and sort of mediated through the mind. And I think that's necessary at one level, but it raises also a number of kind of questions about what does it mean then to have an ethics, and what happens to the traditional forms of ethics. One of the things that seems like it comes out of it is that ethics becomes less cognitive content, schema, rules, maps, etc., and more about a kind of experience or a state of consciousness. And so if that's the case, then it seems like we need to then have ethical theories or models of ethics from the top down that are sensitive to that. And maybe one resource that I was thinking of is Charles Taylor's work, the philosopher who was actually at one of the first Mind Life Institutes. And Taylor's philosophy is really brilliant because he's trying to posit a sort of non-dual ontology of the person where ethics isn't sort of tacked onto life in the way that the Western dualism does with subject or fact value split, but like from Taylor's perspective, everything is inherently ethical. So it's a matter of being open to sensing the ethical quality that's already there. So I'm just curious about if you guys are thinking about that. I just think it's something maybe would be fun to puzzle through together.
Thank you for that question. Actually, I don't know if it is, strictly speaking, correct to say that all the traditional approach to ethics has been really from the top down. Yes, if you look at the Western tradition, maybe Aristotelian ethics is slightly different, which is kind of character-based, but much of Western ethical theories have been really more action-oriented and an attempt to tease out the underlying rules and then develop prescriptions based upon that so that the individuals can have a set of internalized rules that they can follow. So it's very action-oriented. That's why there's a tremendous emphasis on being able to distinguish between what is right and wrong. This whole languaging of right and wrong and good and bad in Western ethical thinking is partly a consequence of that focus on action. But if you look at the Buddhist approach to ethics, it's much more nuanced. Buddhists tend to, and I mean this is of course my own personal interpretation, yes, we do see prescriptions and rules at the initial stage of ethical practice, shila. You have by the precepts. But the precepts are really shorthands to remind you of the underlying principles. Mm-hmm. And the focus is really on the development of the character, the individual. And that's why the emphasis on compassion, the emphasis on no self, releasing the strong grasping at self-centeredness. An idea here is if you develop your character, then ethical action will come naturally out of it. Mm-hmm. So that is really the Buddhist approach. So it's not strictly speaking correct to say that the traditional approach really has been kind of a top-down. There is a sort of a bottom-up approach as well.
Any other questions?
I think this is a wonderful discussion and also has pedagogical implications. If one's speaking about a secular ethics, which will be education from early childhood all the way through adult, then one has to understand, of course, that there are age-appropriate methods at each point. So the way in which one supports the ethical life of a 5-year-old would be different than a 10-year-old, and a 15 and a 20-year-old, and so on. At certain stages, indeed, there may be a proper place for precepts or rule-based kind of ethics. But as one moves from imitation and authority to maybe more imagination and engagement on ethical problems through imagination, to reasoned discourse around ethical issues, there's also a comparable, I think, I could say, trajectory towards liberation. If one thinks, at least as I think about it, there's a twin movement, a movement towards freedom and a movement towards a kind of ethical autonomy in a certain sense. In other words, if one becomes so wise that one sees all the factors that are influencing our ethical conduct, our behavior, and is able to create a space of true freedom, liberation, then one can ask the deep question, well, in that state of complete clarity, what's the foundation for ethical action? It's no longer biological, it's no longer psychological factors, it's no longer societal pressures, no rules are obtained. And then I think what you were speaking about the non-dual world, that wisdom will have the potential to be an ethical wisdom as well. In other words, we will perceive the good, or there'll be a nihilistic, there will be nothing. In my view, that's the true state of enlightenment. So we are in our pedagogy, I think, tied to this extraordinary opportunity to not only educate in the early childhood and say youthful years, but also we're really taking on this infinite project. And it's not just a Buddhist project. In the Christian West, Marguerite Claret, a 13th century mystic, declared that she would step out of the church of the little, which was the church of the rules, and step into the church of love. And then she quotes St. Augustine, love, love, and do what you will. And that if you act out of love, then that which you will be the good. She was actually burned at the stake for saying that in the year 1305, I believe. But I think we're at that point where this is exactly what the project is. That we will do that which is the good out of freedom and out of love and not out of requirements.
Any comments on that? His Holiness, you would like to say something on this? Okay.
We often find that new ideas are they lose their essence with the time. We often find that new discoveries lose their juice with time. So my question is that how can we keep the essence of contemplative thinking, contemplative education within our education systems without it becoming rigid, without it losing its own essence, and so that it may retain its shine throughout the period up to which it is implemented, so to speak. It remains what it is intended for, so that it doesn't become rigid. So how do we do that? I mean, unlike other ideas, how do we protect it like that?
Back to this question, contemplative education, rather than being just a course, if we moved it into the core of academia and we centered all our learning practices through it, would it be able to be so innovative to solve all and many more problems? I mean, not just taught as one course, but as a practice. If people were trained to do contemplative thinking fully, then you think it would be able to change the face of education and deliver with it innovation, solutions, harmony. You think it could turn that all around? Because what the universities abroad seems to do, and what the Delhi University also proposes to do, is experiment with the idea and then probably hope that it will do that. Do you think it will change the world 2.0 or maybe about 200 years from now? Does it project to 200 years from now?
I think Arthur said something like that, that it is, you are doing a core course, but then you are adding something I think that was what you said in the morning.
Let's say 200 years from now, I wouldn't be there, but this would be the new program. What would be the university look like?
I can perhaps...
I can say just a couple of things about that. It seems to me there will always be a place for the cultivation of analytical capacities of reason, and there will always be a place for the analytical development of capacities of reason, logic, and so forth in the ways in which we currently do that. The information that we learn and so forth, that transfer. But I think what we have forgotten is, you might say, an education for creativity, insight, the new. If you take Einstein's sustained attention, it wasn't just a sustained attention. It was sustained attention with a puzzle and a set of contradictory factors that confounded him for a decade in 2 different cases. In other words, he had to live with a particular kind of tension or suspended judgment for a long period of time until that transformation of consciousness took place in him that could see through where no one else had seen before. That quality, I don't think, is trained. We don't think it's trainable. We don't think it's possible to cultivate. But in point of fact, I think the contemplative is really designed to not impart rational and reasoned modalities of inquiry, but actually a way of learning to see. That's the reason I use that Goethe quote, a new organ is opened. Every object well contemplated opens a new organ in us. And so I think the pedagogy that we're proposing is a complement. It won't replace, but it'll fill out and complement what we do so well. But it's like trying to walk on one leg, you know? You can get there, but you end up hopping a long distance. In this case, I think we'll really learn to not only walk, but to run with the creativity, the insight, the intuition that can be supported and sustained through that. To me, everything, if I just speak my mind, I think everything that's new comes through this doorway.
I think we are running out of time. I will ask Richard, he wants to say something.
I just wanted to make one brief point in response to your question. I think one of the principal ways in which the university would change as a consequence of this kind of approach is that the faculty would approach their job as promoting human flourishing and relieving human suffering. And I don't think that's the way most faculty come to work every day right now. And I think that would produce an enormous change if they really had the intention that the work that they were doing is to cultivate human flourishing in the deepest possible way, rather than to teach chemistry or to teach literature. I think it would produce a completely different zeitgeist in the university.
I think then the Vice Chancellor should send us to the CCT program at Stanford for 1 year. That would be a help.
Anu, we are running out of time. I think...
Yeah, I just wanted to add to Richie perhaps a personal anecdote. So I'm usually in a very academic, classical German setting where we work only with the mind and very, rational. But because I was developing this program from Monday to Wednesday, I was in normal meetings, without any contemplative praxis, just rational logic. Then from Thursday to Saturday, we developed with the teachers the protocol. And so more and more researchers came to these meetings because they wanted to know what they have to develop for research. And because all these teachers were naturally contemplative, sometimes when we were too much in our head, they just said, let's go in silence and breathe for 5 minutes. And so we developed a mixed contemplative practice in normal meetings. And more of my scientists were telling me, why don't we do that every day? They were saying it from themselves, and I could see how the atmosphere got better. We were solving problems faster, the ideas got better, and the question the scientists asked and the measures they developed were different. They came out different questions, and so that was, for me, one of the deepest experiences.
Thank you, Tanya. I think at the end of the day, we are seeing a lot of clarity, and everybody is coming out with their contemplations, but I think we have to end the session here. And I would invite His Holiness to give his closing remarks, and the Vice Chancellor.
If our meeting is more formal way, then perhaps at the end is some kind of few nice words I should say. But I consider these are informal talk, so not necessary. Yes, I think Vice Chancellor should say something. I have nothing.
I have nothing to say. I think it has been a very memorable day for all of us. And I'm very, very optimistic, confident that some positive structures will emerge. The one thing, Holiness, that gives me enormous heart is that this group of youngsters, these students, have sat through the whole day's proceedings with single-minded attention. and therefore, I believe all will be well.
Vote of thanks.
The main purpose of our this meeting is, as I mentioned before, you see, the serious discussion how to introduce in modern, the existing secular education these moral ethics. That's our main aim. Then is a question and answer. So according each individual some questions. Then I think even 100 years will not finish. So at this moment, as I mentioned this morning, I think I think if someone I think carry serious research, people, more educated people, they are in mental level more peaceful, more happier, or those people who carry simple life, less education, amount of their calmer mind. I think we should investigate these things. Then we will know what's wrong. Education is supposed to bring meaningful life. Meaningful life means not money, not power, bully other, cheating other. No. The purpose of education is build healthy person. Healthy, not only physical, but mind. So a lot of educated people who actually troublemaker. What's that? Even religious people becoming troublemaker. What's wrong? So these are real questions. Now we have to think seriously. Then, in spite of these problems, we just so long, myself, okay, then no problem. I think that's immoral. We are part of humanity. We have to think of humanity. And from the selfish viewpoint also, humanity happy. For example, India, 1 billion Indian, happy, honest, truthful. I think these unnecessary problems certainly will reduce. I think government spend a lot of money, crores of money, but at least, if not half, I think big portion go to private pocket. Clear? All these, one time, I'm coming back from Orissa to Delhi. At the airport, we are waiting. One parliament member of that area also is there. Then I asked him, oh, these because of the tribal area. I said, people, it's very poor.
So there must be some organization, and even government level, I think should be special attention about these people. Then he told me, yes, there are programs, but because of corruption, amount of money they receive for these people, big portion wasted, go private pocket. And recently I was in Ladakh, also it's the same that way. So it is, you see, impossible for each person arrest and some punishment. Impossible. One generation of corrupted people, you see, we can perhaps write 100,000 because of arrest. Then next year, another 100,000 come. Impossible. So we have to think the root cause, right? Root cause. Oh. So education really building self-centered, blind sort of self-centered attitude. That's wrong. Religion failed. So now we must find another ways and means to tackle this problem. Isn't it? So that's our aim. So then, I think first let us, you see, work with that for that. And then once you see that draft, concrete draft, you see, proposal, you see, finished. Then another occasion, we can discuss various different sort of points, and then okay, doesn't matter. Vice Chancellor agree? Yes.
Your Holiness, you began the day by asking a very key question, by posing this question to us: how can we build a happier society? And I think we've spent the whole day listening to scientists and their findings, which show us the possibilities for bringing about very real, tangible change. And I think in this spirit, I would also like to thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor and Pro-Vice Chancellor for really being instrumental in initiating a very radical change in the University of Delhi, which perhaps will not be appreciated today as much as it will be in the future. The 4-year program, which includes this compulsory component on integrating the mind, body, and heart. I would also like to thank Arthur Sceince, Richie Davidson, Thupten Jinpala, and Tanya Singer for the time and for coming to Delhi University to make their excellent presentations. Dr. Lobsang Sangye, the Prime Minister of Tibet in exile, for his time and presence here.
Usually,
he's not here.
I made correction when some people describe him or even previous of us today, or leader. You see, the Prime Minister of the exile government. Right from the beginning, you see, although this is de facto sort of exile government, but you see, we never use the word exile government. So we never use Prime Minister. So therefore, we usually describe the political leader of our central administration, like that, political leader of our community. That's all. So the Prime Minister, this word, again means, you see, above Prime Minister, either President or something, or King. I completely retired. Ordinary citizen of Tibet, or like that. So actually he, like President, all power in his hand. So I usually, you see, make clear that, firstly, we are not seeking independence. I think some young Tibetan may sort of against that. But think more seriously, holistic way, and realistic way. Leave aside emotion. This is a serious matter, our struggle. So we must be realistic. in order to develop realistic sort of approach, we have to know all the reality, holistic. So sometimes you see the people, you see, loves comparison 13 Dalai Lama and 1913, and now 2013. Big differences. At that time, Chinese emperor collapsed. The central authority collapsed. I think 1912 collapsed. So those forces inside Tibet, no sort of there. There is no support from so very easy. Now today, I think about a million Chinese soldiers in different parts of Tibet. And strong government there, economically. Even in the United States and the European unions, you see, very much sort of serious concern about close relations with China. I think number of occasions, I think people sincerely practice hypocrisy. Here's something different view, but hello, like that. Sometimes I teasing diplomats. Oh, you are expert about hypocrisy. So in any way, so we must accept, whether good or bad, we must accept the reality. Not easy. Last 60 years, at my age, at 16 till 76, 60 years, I involved. I seek advice from Pandit Nehru and many Indian freedom fighters. Not easy. So government of India also, you see, recognize Tibet autonomous region of People's Republic of China. So things are not easy. And then most important, the solution for our conflict, we must have support from Chinese people. So our middle way approach is really brought a lot of support from Chinese, mainly Chinese thinkers, writers, and educationists. So these number very few, but any society, intellectuals, thinkers are very important. So therefore, I think one example, after 2008 crisis, we noticed about over 1,000 articles in Chinese language wrote by Chinese. All fully support about our middle way approach. And very critical about their own government policy. I consider, I never take this credit away, but I believe because of our way of approach, not one side win, one side lose, no, mutual benefit. I try to say, because of the bluntly mentioned to these young Tibetans. I think among even here, I think after finishing your study, whenever opportunity comes, I think you are thinking go to America. I think few thousand Tibetans from India illegally immigrated to Europe and America. These not seeker for spirituality from like Davidson or these Tibetans not sort of even illegally immigrate America, not for spiritual sort of reason, but money, dollar. So many Tibetans consider rupee is cheap, dollar is high. or euro also is quite high. So actually, you see, Tibetan also, you see, we are human beings. We want modernized Tibet. Clear? So as far as material development is concerned, if we remain within the people of China, it is our interest. Provided they must give us. Arsedev, Kazoda, Chisani, sort of full authority, taking care about our own culture, our own language, our own spirituality, our own environment. All these Tibetan should have the full authority. Then we can take care about these things. So that's the mutual benefit. Okay. So therefore, the Chinese government always accuse us we are seeking independence. Actually, the Chinese leaders knows we are not seeking independence, but they find easier blame these Tibetan, including Dalai Lama, seeking separation. So much easier to tell 13 about 1.3 billion Chinese people. If the people knows Dalai Lama and our political leadership, these are not seeking separation, independence, then people will get some kind of question. Why? Then the Chinese government remain Kasota. No contact like that. So therefore, if we say we have exile government, implication is we are seeking separation. So that won't help, our problem. And then also, that may create more problem to Indian government. So therefore, many years ago, one press meeting, one Indian journalist, he described, then the former Kalunchiba, Professor Samdurumchi, he described Prime Minister, exile government. I immediately made it clear. We never call exile government Prime Minister. Simply, the head of our central administration. Immediately I made clear. So, of course, I appreciate. I think this morning, I think you also use that word. I appreciate. So I think the educated Indian knows one time the president, the chief minister of Himachal. Once I visited his own sort of palace in Kasatimi, Rampur. He mentioned during his father, what kind of relation and trade between Tibet, and he mentioned at that time complete sort of independent country. So many Indians, knows that. So you also expressed that way, but now we have to past. Why? We are an independent nation. 7th century, 8th century, 9th century, we invaded China. 1955, 54, I mentioned this morning. When 1955, I returned from Peking to Lhasa. On the way, I spent a few days in Xingen. They call Chang'an or something. So the Buddha statue in Lhasa Cathedral actually is brought from that. So one day, that day, no sort of official sort of formal program. So we just rest. So afternoon, we just go the sightseeing of the ancient city's wall while we sort of rest, relax. I think most probably, vice chairman of the provinces. See, he also with us. He mentioned in ancient time, Tibetan army reached up to this wall. So Chinese emperor have to fled. So at that time, due to Tibetan army, the Chinese emperor fled. So 1959, due to Chinese army, we fled. so in any way, like that, you see the ancient time, Tibet in Central Asia, very forceful, so it was a very powerful nation. So we always make clear, past, we are a separate country, linguistically, culturally, even geographically. We are separate. But we always looking forward. We do not want to repeat past history. Clear? So therefore, and then I always is looking with admiration, the spirit of European Union. Dr. Adenauer, your first president, Chancellor Adenauer, and de Gaulle. French was that big nose, so really very, very big nose. You see, these, oh yes, both this. Really, these people, I think, a lot of vision. So you see, they create European Union. I think wonderful. And India also, actually, they, Bigno Babaji, I think many of you, I think, heard. I had, fortunately, one meeting. A wonderful person. He creates, he expressed one vision, ABC. Do you heard? Some of you heard? So the meaning, A means Afghanistan, B means Burma, C means Ceylon, Sri Lanka. Then India, Pakistan. As someone has mentioned, before partition, one. So on top of that, Afghanistan, Burma, Sri Lanka join. So some kind of federation he expressed. I'm quite sure if that idea materialized, then the lot of unnecessary problem between India and Pakistan no longer there. And also Afghanistan may be much peaceful today. And Sri Lanka as well. So now time come. We are not in 7th century, 8th, because of that, that is, or those was before, say, 18th, 19th century. At that time, each sort of sovereign state, they consider their own sort of sovereignty as something very sacred. Now today, reality much changed. European Union needs America. America needs European Union. And the whole Europe needs Middle East. Middle East needs West. As well as India and China. The East needs West. West needs East. That's today's reality, isn't it? So the common interest is the top most important. Therefore, we also is thinking, common interest. Let us try to achieve that. No problem. So therefore, this is the why I'm making this correction, that or clarification. This is a clarification about that, not out of fear, but some sound reasons. So I just want to tell you. That's all. Thank you. Now finished?
Yeah, just sum it up in 1 minute.
Yes, yes, yes.
We also want to appreciate Professor Samten-La, who has been coming, the Vice Chancellor of Central University for Tibetan Studies, who has also been joining our meetings as a resource person with our teachers, and also for being present today. Very importantly, I'd like to acknowledge Tempa Seringla, representative of your representative in the bureau in Delhi.
Yes, that's okay.
Yeah.
I retired from political. Political responsibility. Yeah. But no way to retire from Dalai Lama.
Yeah. We won't leave you. We also won't leave you. And he has worked so hard and so compassionately with us for organizing your visit.
And lastly, can I thank Anurita?
Yeah, I was going to do that. Yes. Anurita, and before that, I would like to acknowledge someone who's not present today, but who has also been very important in as a resource person, and that's your Director of Tibet House, Geshe Dorji Damdullah, who has been a source of enormous wisdom, guidance, and strength to us. Our teachers have had discussions with him on a one-to-one basis. They have been inviting him to their colleges. He's been giving talks and maintaining very close relations. Thank you, Your Holiness, for him as well. And last of all, not the least, I'd like to thank Anurita, who's an associate professor at Maitri College, and Anuradha, who's an assistant professor at Lakshmibai College, who worked very hard for organizing this event. And all the teachers and resource persons who've been taking part in the meetings for the teaching of the pilot course on secular ethics in 10 colleges of Delhi University. Many of them are present today. Some of their students are also present. We'd like to thank you for taking the plunge and say that your work is going to be really useful to the course being planned for the 4-year program. So your feedback will be invaluable for that. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
The topic which we already, topic or goal which already discussed, this is not responsibility of few individuals. Everyone have that responsibility. Think more seriously and try to work for that. Thank you.